Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at Shakespeare's The Tempest. And instead of doing the traditional video where I discuss the play first and then talk about plot, I'm going to split this into three shorter videos to focus on three different aspects of the play that I find interesting. In this video, I'm going to focus on plot and conflict within this play. A lot of times when my students first read this play, they have some difficulty with the plot. Not that the action is difficult to understand, or the complex backstory to this play difficult to understand, but it feels wrong. This stems in part from the fact that this play focuses on the perspective of Prospero. If the play were shifted to another character, let's say Ferdinand, then it might be a hero's journey story that is filled with complexity and disaster, but ultimately culminates in him finding a beautiful woman to marry. He has conflict, he survives that conflict, and pushes through that conflict, and ultimately comes out to live happily ever after. But the fact is, we're looking at it all through Prospero's eyes, and hearing his commentary in the background. We realize that Ferdinand doesn't really win Prospero over. Prospero has been pulling the strings this whole time to get Ferdinand to be and do what he wants him to do. Prospero wants Ferdinand to marry his daughter Miranda, because by so doing it means that Miranda and her children will inherit the kingdom of Naples. Instead of the young hero, our central protagonist is the elderly mage character. And his motives and conflicts are different and perhaps more complex than what we expect from a journey story or a hero story. On the surface, Prospero's conflict is with his enemies who wronged him in the past, his brother who deposed him and left him out to die at sea, the King Alonso who aided his brother, and all of their friends and lackeys. They have caused Prospero much suffering in the past, and now he has the power and the opportunity to get his revenge. But again, when we look at conflict here, the plot falls a little flat. If our only interest is in the power struggle between Prospero and all the others, there's not much power struggle, really. Prospero holds all the cards from the very first scene to the very end. And sure, he lays down his hand at the last scene, but he's never in any danger. There is that 2 seconds where he forgets that Caliban is coming to murder him, but as soon as he remembers, he's able to just snap his fingers and resolve that problem. He has no real danger. So, is his conflict with others? Perhaps you've studied different types of conflict. Person versus nature. I think it's important to remember, especially with this play, that it could be a person versus self kind of conflict. It's not so much his conflict with his enemies that is Prospero's struggle, but his conflict with his desire for revenge. Shakespeare has several plays about revenge. Look at Hamlet or Titus Andronicus. We see that revenge ends usually really badly. On the other hand, in this play, Prospero chooses to forgive his enemies. For a long time, it looks like he's not going to do that. In Act 3, Scene 3, for instance, he says, "They are now in my power." And in Act 4, Scene 1, he says, "At this hour lies at my mercy all my enemies." We've watched him pull all the strings and manipulate all of his enemies into a position to crush them. And it sure looks like he's going to do that. But just as he has that opportunity, we have a powerful moment where Ariel, who has been kind of pushed along a little bit too far as well, says that he would pity Prospero's enemies. At the very beginning of Act 5, Ariel is describing how he has left the king and all of his companions, confined together in the same fashion as you gave in charge, just as you left them, all prisoners, sir, in the lime grove which weather fens your cell. They cannot budge till your release. The king, his brother, and yours abide all three distracted, and the remainder mourn over them, brimful of sorrow and dismay. But chiefly him that you termed, sir, the good old Lord Gonzalo. His tears run down his beard like winter's drops from eaves of reeds. Your charm so strongly works 'em, that if you now beheld them, your affections would become tender. Prospero says, "Dost thou think so, spirit?" And Ariel answered, "Mine would, sir, were I human." Ariel reminds Prospero that in his vengeance, he's also hurting one of his dear beloved friends, Gonzalo, the man who helped save him from death all those years ago. And true human affection would pity and offer forgiveness in this moment. Even Ariel, who's merely a wind spirit, is able to see that. It's also worth noting that this play falls more in the category of the romance. We think of Shakespeare's comedies that end happily, Shakespeare's tragedies that end tragically. His romances are their own special category. Generally, a romance covers a lengthy amount of time. It involves a family that's been torn apart, usually by a mistake that one of the members has made. But ultimately, at the end, they're reunited, and there's frequently large scenes of forgiveness and reconciliation. Think of Cymbeline or Pericles. Although the Tempest happens in a very brief amount of time, there's a lot of time crunched into this play. There are years of history that are retold in Act 1, Scene 2 and Act 2, Scene 1. And the events of the past heavily weigh on and influence and transform the events of the moment. Prospero has all of this anger and resentment from the past that he's been holding on to all these years. And the sins of the past are finally visited upon the sinners. But ultimately, in this romantic form, there is a moment of reconciliation and reunion at the end. Prospero is reunited with his brother. Now, it doesn't seem like Antonio has changed all that much, but Prospero has offered him the opportunity for forgiveness. And King Alonso certainly has changed, and he and Prospero are reunited and drawn close, and they become a kind of family at this point, because now their children are going to be married. And from here on, both of their descendants will be kings of Naples. Once we recognize that the true conflict is within Prospero, whether or not he can let go of his past anger and ultimately forgive his enemies, and then move on to become a better leader without the faults he had in the past, the movement and action makes a whole lot more sense. Of course, whether or not Prospero could ever be a good leader is up for debate, and something I'm going to talk about in another video. For now, let's walk through the action. Act 1, Scene 1 opens with the Tempest of the title. A terrible storm is crashing into this boat. The boat contains the King Alonso and his courtiers. They've just come from marrying his daughter off to the King of Tunis, and there's a bit of a power struggle between the sailors and the courtiers. It appears that the ship goes down, and all of them with it. In Scene 2, from the island, the young woman Miranda sees the ship struggling in the storm, and she's very upset, and so she goes to talk to her father. He explains that he's actually preserved all of the people on the boat using his magic, and then explains the purpose of the magical storm to Miranda by telling her her life story. A story that he'd kept hidden from her all of these years, since they first arrived at the island when she was only 3 years old. He used to be the Duke of Milan, but he let his brother have more and more charge of his ducely duties, until finally his brother decided to depose him and get rid of him. So his brother basically sold out Milan to the King of Naples for military support in overthrowing the other duke. Prospero was placed in a rotten boat and sent out to sea, but with the help of his dear friend Gonzalo, he was able to take some of his books and some food and water with him. And so they were able to arrive on this deserted island. And now those same people who did him all that wrong in the past are on that boat, and Prospero has the opportunity to change his fortune. He then magically puts Miranda to sleep in order to talk to his fairy servant Ariel. We learn that Ariel was imprisoned in a pine tree by an old witch, Sycorax, and Prospero freed Ariel. And in repayment, Ariel has had to work and do magic for Prospero for several years. He's the one that did the magical storm on the boat. Ariel is eager to finish his time of servitude, and Prospero retells his story to remind him of his place. He has 2 days left of service, and there's a lot of magic he has left for Ariel to do to help him finish his plans with all of his enemies here. He wakes Miranda back up, and then they speak to the other person on the island, Caliban the monster. Caliban is the son of the aforementioned witch Sycorax. She was exiled from Algiers and arrived on this island and gave birth to Caliban, who used to be the only inhabitant of this island other than the fairies. Now he does drudgery and slave labor for Prospero. Apparently, Prospero used to treat him somewhat kindly, and Miranda taught him to speak and use language. But Caliban tried to rape Miranda, and ever since they've kept him busy with physical labor and beatings. Anytime he complains or curses, Prospero uses magic to pinch him all over. There's definitely a lot of interesting historical master-slave, native colonizer imagery going on there, which I'm going to explore in another video. They send Caliban out to go gather more firewood, and then they turn to meet Ferdinand. Ferdinand is the prince, the son of King Alonso. He was washed ashore on the island, and Ariel has been leading him here. He thinks that he's the only survivor of the shipwreck. He sees Miranda and pretty much immediately falls in love with her, which is exactly what Prospero wants, but Prospero decides to make things a little tough for him. He plays the really harsh dad. He magically binds Ferdinand and tells him that he's going to force him to do labor, saying he doesn't believe Ferdinand's story. Miranda is a bit heartbroken to see this beautiful young man, the first man she's ever really seen other than Caliban and her dad, therefore the first remotely feasible love interest. And she tries to plead with her father, but he refuses to listen to her and acts very harshly towards Ferdinand. And so we come to the end of Act 1. Act 2. We cut to Alonso, who's wandering with the rest of his entourage around the island. Gonzalo is trying very hard to cheer him up, but it's useless because Alonso thinks that his son is dead. He also feels a lot of guilt because he married his daughter against her will to the king of Tunis. And that was the reason for his voyage, and therefore he feels a lot of guilt about the death of his son. We also get to know Sebastian, his brother, and Antonio, Prospero's brother, a bit better. The two of them like to stand to the side and mock everyone. They bitterly mock the king for his mistake of marrying his daughter away and getting them shipwrecked on this island. They also mock Gonzalo for his good-natured prattling. Just then, Ariel comes in and puts all of them to sleep except Sebastian and Antonio. Left alone, Antonio nudges Sebastian pretty insistently and says, hey, you know what? Since Ferdinand's dead, if we were just to kind of kill the king in his sleep, you'd be king. It takes a while for Sebastian to take that hint, and we see Antonio's ambition. He overthrew his brother Prospero, and now he's trying to get Sebastian to do the same thing, hoping that he will be able to free Milan from Naples' power. Just the two of them pull out their swords and get ready to stab. Ariel wakes up Gonzalo, who then wakes everyone else. When everyone pops their heads up and looks around and wonders why they have their swords drawn, the two of them have to say, well, we heard a noise, we thought it was some lions. And so everyone gets up and continues on to look for Ferdinand a little more. Meanwhile, Caliban is out gathering wood, and the storm is still thundering overhead. Caliban sees someone coming and hides under his gabardine or his cloak, hoping it's not a spirit come to pinch him for delaying too long. It's not. It's Trinculo, who's a clownish servant of Alonso. He also thinks he's the only one who's survived the storm. He stumbles across Caliban and wonders what this strange creature is, when up comes Stefano, the drunken butler of Alonso. He managed to wash ashore on a wine keg, and he's been enjoying it ever since. Trinculo hides before he recognizes Stefano, and so when Stefano comes and sees a cloak with 4 legs sticking out of it, he thinks it's a monster. He thinks maybe he'll capture it and bring it home and show it off in Naples. And as Caliban trembles in fright, thinking he's about to be pinched apart by spirits, Stefano gives him a drink of the wine. Caliban is so overwhelmed by the amazing taste of the liquor that he pledges his fealty to Stefano, thinking that Stefano is a great lord or a god. Trinculo and Stefano are reunited, and Trinculo makes comical commentary throughout this whole scene. Caliban decides that he's going to throw off his servitude to Prospero and serve a better master in Stefano, not realizing that he's swearing to serve a no-good drunk. Act 3. Ferdinand is carrying logs for Prospero when up comes Miranda. She can't stay away from him even though Prospero told her to. She thinks that Prospero is off studying and doesn't know what's going on, but really he's watching the whole time. And he sees Ferdinand and Miranda confess their love to each other and swear to marry each other, clasping each other's hands, which was a kind of Elizabethan marriage ceremony. This is all exactly what Prospero wants. Meanwhile, Stefano, Trinculo, and Caliban are making good progress on that wine cask. Caliban suggests that Stefano go kill Prospero in his sleep, and then he can rule the island and marry Miranda. Ariel arrives to overhear this and starts playing pranks on them, using the voice of Trinculo to cause them to all fight each other. Afterwards, Ariel begins playing some music, which they then follow. In scene 3, we cut back to King Alonso's party. They've continued searching for Ferdinand to no avail, and Alonso is ready to give up, when all of a sudden all of these fairies appear and dance around them and bring this beautiful table out with all this wonderful food. Alonso's still discouraged, but urged by his servants, he goes to eat the food, along with Sebastian and Antonio. Just as they're about to eat this beautiful feast, up appears a magical harpy. It's actually Ariel in disguise. With his magic, he makes the beautiful feast vanish right in front of them, and then condemns them for their past sin of overthrowing Prospero. But remember, for that's my business to you, that you 3 from Milan did supplant good Prospero, exposed unto the sea, which hath requited him and his innocent child, for which foul deed these powers, delaying, not forgetting, have incensed the seas and shores, yea, all the creatures against your peace. Thee of thy son, Alonso, they have bereft, and I do pronounce by me lingering perdition, worse than any death can be at once, shall step by step attend you in your ways, whose wraths to guard you from, which here in this most desolate isle, else falls upon your heads, is nothing but heart sorrow and a clear life ensuing. He reminds them of their past, shows them their present, the death of Ferdinand, and curses Alonso with a life of living perdition. He won't be able to die, but he'll suffer agonizing misery. Prospero watches all of this, pleased to have his enemies exactly where he wants them. Alonso, Antonio, and Sebastian are driven near mad by this, and they run off, Gonzalo and the others following after and trying to calm them. And so we reach Act 4. In Act 4, Prospero tells Ferdinand how he was just messing with him to test his love for Miranda, and now the two of them can be married. Of course, father of the bride emphasizes really explicitly that he expects abstinence until after their marriage. He then puts on a big magical show for them, where the figures from Roman mythology, Ceres, Iris, and Juno, perform a song and a dance for them, blessing their wedding, but also emphasizing that they're leaving Venus out. None of that kissing stuff until after you all have tied the knot. However, at the end of the dance, Prospero suddenly remembers Caliban and his plot against him, and calls a stop to the whole thing. He has a fascinating speech about the stuff dreams are made of. I'm going to touch on that and the other ideas about magic and art in a separate video. He sends Miranda and Ferdinand off, and turns to Ariel, and prepares for Caliban. Basically, he hangs out a line of really nice laundry. Fancy clothes. And when Caliban, Stefano, and Trinculo sneak up to murder him, Stefano and Trinculo see the beautiful clothing, the rich robes, and they can't resist trying to steal it all, in spite of Caliban's warnings that they need to hurry up and get rid of Prospero before it's too late. Prospero then sends all of his fairy servants transformed into hounds, chasing after them, as if in a wild hunt, and they run off to be pinched and tortured by the fairy spirits. Act 5 opens with Prospero speaking to Ariel. This is the scene I mentioned before where Ariel expresses his pity for Gonzalo and the others, and Prospero shows that pity as well. He decides to forgive his enemies. He's also reminded one more time that it is time to let go of Ariel. And so, drawing a magical circle around himself, he says that he is going to break his staff and throw away his books and leave behind his magic after this. In come the poor tormented souls that Prospero has been torturing this whole time. And seeing them, Prospero feels pity for them. Even the jerk Antonio, who probably hasn't really changed. But most especially he feels for Gonzalo, because Gonzalo was really a good guy. And so he changes back into his duke robes, getting rid of his magic robes, and then sets all of their minds free from their distraction and madness. And they find themselves standing there with the former Duke of Milan, Prospero. Alonso, of course, has trouble believing his eyes at first because of all the weird magical things that have happened to him. But Prospero embraces and forgives each one of them, although he also does put Sebastian and Antonio in their place, reminding them, letting them know that he knows about their plot against Alonso. Alonso immediately gives Prospero his dukedom back. Alonso's still, though, grieving over his lost son. And Prospero says, oh, I also lost my daughter at the same time. But then Prospero opens up his cell, and there's Miranda and Ferdinand playing chess. Probably a metaphor. And Ferdinand's cheating. And so they're all reunited and happy, except, I guess, Antonio and Sebastian. And here come the other sailors to say that their ship is just fine, and they were all sort of magically asleep in it. And here comes Caliban and Trinculo and Stefano, who are all black and blue with pinches. And Caliban, seeing Stefano standing next to his master, realizes that Prospero was the better master all along. More on that in another video. Does Prospero at this point forgive him and let him go, giving the island back to him? That question is not answered by the text itself, and so there are various ways to play it up in production. I will note that Antonio and Sebastian have gone back to making fun of things, as they poke fun at Caliban here, showing they probably haven't changed very much. In fact, Antonio's only line in this entire scene is, "Very like, one of them is a plain fish and no doubt marketable. We could sell Caliban on the market, he looks so much like a fish." That doesn't really seem to bode much for change. In any case, Prospero says he will explain everything to all the rest of them as they sail back home. And he asks Ariel in parting to help them to sail home, because he's going to get rid of his magic. And he has one final epilogue, which is incredibly important to this play. Basically, he's asking for the applause of the audience, which is a pretty common thing in a lot of Shakespeare's plays. But he's asking for their applause because he's given up his power and his magic at this point. And he wants a kind of release, as he's given release to these others. So that's the plot of The Tempest. If you're interested in other aspects of The Tempest, in another video I'm going to talk about power and post-colonialism, how the play represents power struggles, and how the play reflects some of the historical events going on with colonialism and empire, the relationship between colonizers and indigenous peoples. In another video, I'm going to talk about magic and art and story, and how in some ways the play explores what it means to be an artist and a creator of magic, as Shakespeare himself is. You can click on the links to watch those videos, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.